afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Gaston Alonso. I'm the director of the Ethel R. Wolf. Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Gaston Alonso. I'm the director of the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities. I'm also a professor in the Department of Political Science, and it is my honor to welcome you. We're doing two things today. One, we're coming together to build community on the campus, and that's a very important thing to do, especially in these times. So I want to thank the Department of Political Science, and I want to thank the Political Science Club for the invitation to build community here today. And then the other thing we're doing is that we are celebrating Professor Ken Estey's new book, Labor Evangelicals, Faith, Authority, and Resistance at Work. So congratulations. It's a wonderful read. If you have not, please make yourselves at home. We have plenty of pizza and drink in the back. Make sure that you enjoy building community as we kind of listen to a presentation. Right? So we're going to start with a conversation between Professor Estey, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science, my colleague. He's also the director of the Studies in Religion program. And Professor Tim Shortell, who's a professor in the Department of Sociology. Secret, I was always wanted to be a sociologist. The college side.
You're welcome anytime.
Yeah. It's recorded. And he was a former director of the Studies in Religion program. They're going to discuss the book. We'll do a question and answer. And then we also have some student groups who will make some short presentations. And then we'll come back together and finish the pizza and have more community building. So, congratulations again, and I turn it to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to just make also some other thank yous. I'm looking right at Anna Law, who is on sabbatical and came out of your sabbatical to be here. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And also, I want to thank the Professional Staff Congress, my union, our union, that created the working conditions that made it possible for me to do the research to do this book. So the Professional Staff Congress, absolutely, yes. And certainly my colleagues, Janet and Professor Johnson, Professor Alonso, Professor Ness, who I saw, and also Professor Cher Abbey, who I just saw come in, who heard an earlier version of this book back a number of years ago. And also a particular shout out to Paul Moses. Paul Moses is now retired, but worked in the English department, journalism, and Paul Moses was always there to ask the question, how is the book going? And certainly Paul, as the head of the search committee that brought me here, certainly created the conditions under which I could do this book. So I just want to make a special shout out to Paul Moses. So if I might stand with some evangelical zeal and read just a few words from the book to give you a sense of the feel, the flavor for it. And so allow me to just find my page. Evangelicals are workers too. They experience joy at work and find fulfillment through it. They get frustrated with it. They feel despair at work. And they ponder over the meaning of their efforts. They experience class and develop various forms of consciousness about class as a result of their labors. They pray before, they pray during, and they pray after work. They worry about work, pay attention to their jobs, and they do work just as everyone else does. Evangelicals are often discussed in terms of politics and culture. The cozy relationship between evangelicalism and capitalism is also a recurring theme. Yet actual evangelicals in the workplace are neglected. Their labor and their class understanding or their class standing is often overlooked. So the trick with most books is you read the beginning, and then you read the end, and then you read in the middle. And this is from the now end of the book. Labor evangelicals always have extra work to do. Their paid labor is only one part of their work. For them, discerning how to be obedient to competing authorities, seeking to be Christ-like, and bringing glory to God through one's work are also required. And vitally, they contend that joy at work should characterize one's earthly labor, not drudgery. Even a gig should never be merely a gig. Whatever the hours, the pay, or the relative prestige and permanence of the position, yet work must always fall short of what it could be. Work often falls short of what it could be for everybody. But labor evangelicals have resources to offer to the evangelical world, given their experience in negotiating class and power relations in the workplace. As they speak for themselves, different possibilities come forward. And that's what this book is about, is to tease out and to look at those possibilities. So, labor evangelicals.
Great. So I'm going to give a brief overview. Ken sort of gave you the best parts, the beginning and the end. I'll talk a little bit about the middle, and then just ask some questions that I think will be helpful in terms of giving us an opportunity to think not just about this study, but some broader issues that might be the reason that you come to the event. But before we get started, I want to do a little interactive thing just to sort of build that in. How many of you have taken a course in studies in religion at the college? One?
No.
Oh. Okay. So the reason that I asked, Professor Estey is the current director of the Studies in Religion program. It's fairly small. I was the director last year. My own work, as with Ken's work, is oriented around religion. I'm interested in religion and identity, the way that religion informs how we understand who we are. So we're interested in sort of spreading the word about the program because we think lots of people are interested in religion and the role that religion plays in the world today, but might not necessarily be thinking of it as something that they can study in classes. And so the Studies in Religion program offers a bachelor's degree, but also there's a minor, and so in a lot of the courses in the curriculum are in the Gen Ed program. So if you're interested in it, I would highly recommend it. I'm sure that you could approach either one of us at any point later on, and we can tell you more about the program. I want to make that pitch, and I hope that in talking about this book, you'll get a sense of how it is that scholars study religion and why that's important, even if you're not interested in this particular religious group or that particular religious group, understanding why it may help to know about religion and the way it helps structure the world and shapes how we think, feel, and act. So I'm going to read just one passage here real quick, just a couple of sentences that I think really, for me, captures what is so great about this book and why this kind of study is so important. The workers' faith and their church communities informed their perceptions about the criteria and conditions of a just workplace, and especially the limits on the amount of work required. Employers often want us to work more than we would choose to work, right? The workers' resistance to the unjust workplace, in turn, shaped how they thought about the Bible and Christian life, right? So when we think about religion and labor, it's not just about how one affects the other, right? It's a complex pattern of interactions and people are simultaneously workers and evangelicals, and they're not always thinking that they're the one or the other at any particular moment. We're often engaging in lots of aspects of our identity at the same time. So the book is a kind of research project called an ethnography, where a researcher goes to communities and learns about the nature of those communities, largely, but not always exclusively, by interviewing people, by asking people questions and listening to their answers, and building up an understanding of the nature of that community through that kind of data collection. And then the researcher comes back and reflects on what they've learned and figures out a way to sort of tell the story based on those interviews, all taken together. So one of the things that's interesting about Ken's research is he chose 2 sites for the research project. One is a congregation in a town in Pennsylvania. So all of the people that he interviewed were members of the congregation and worked in different places. Some were unionized and some not, right? And so the folks in that site who were unionized might have been in different professions in different union locals and so forth. And then his second site was a union local in North Carolina, right? So there, people all worked in the same place, and they knew the workplace, and the workplace was shaping, their lives. And they were evangelicals, but not all belonging to the same congregation. Okay. So if we think about, and this is the power of an ethnography, is to be able to sort of capture some of that life world of people and understand how we are shaped by both our religious community, if we choose to have one, and also our work community. So that leads me to my first question for Professor Estey, which is, how did you come to think about the project as a comparison between these 2 communities, and what do you think the significance of that comparison is?
Yes, so the original impulse, and I followed through on it, certainly was to go to Moncure, North Carolina, and to follow up on Lewis Cameron's, the union president's, claim that they were standing on the promises of God to see them through their labor struggle at Moncure Plywood. And he, being a plywood worker, found himself and the union in deep trouble because Moncure Plywood was bought by private equity, and they were determined to get rid of the union, and they were struggling for their work lives. And I came to learn through a magazine called Labor Notes about this struggle, and decided, okay, this will be the place that I will go and research. Just let's see, south of Raleigh, North Carolina, a good 8-hour drive from here if you're moving along pretty evenly. So I didn't say speeding, but and then I was deep into that exploration, visiting the not to go inside as much as I wanted to go inside the plywood factory, but certainly going to the churches, attending church services, inviting people to the local Golden Corral just to interview them there, interview in their homes, wherever I could get them to, have some time away from their work, as best as I could over a number of summers, starting in 2009. And then I, shared some of this research at the American Academy of Religion, which is the guild for studies in religion, the American Academy of Religion. And a colleague suggested, well, why don't you look at another community? And, it was interesting to gain that challenge because, and that's what led me to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And this is Bethlehem Steel. This is the last, this is what's left of Bethlehem Steel is the stacks here. So in Moncure, North Carolina, the workers I interviewed there were all African American. In Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, all white. And it was a way to look at 2 different sites in the country and 2 different sets of evangelicals, because a lot of times, and I led with the idea, the African American workers at Moncure Plywood, absolutely and certainly evangelical, with a very high regard for the Bible, that Jesus Christ is Savior and Lord, the need to be born again, to witness to others, to bring those others to salvation through Jesus Christ, sort of evangelical notions. But not everybody agrees in the scholarly community that you can so readily align African American evangelicals who believe these things. They say, well, no, that's just the black church. This is a longer discussion. So they said, you should go and interview, what we usually assume in the scholarly literature, and I think popularly too, white evangelicals. And the white evangelicals then were at New Covenant Community Christian Church in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So this was an interesting challenge. I followed up on it. 2 chapters are set in Moncure at the plywood factory, and 2 are set at the church at New Covenant and Bethlehem Steel. I thought I would see a lot of Beth Steel alums. I ended up interviewing a lot of public school teachers instead. What I found, however, when you introduce the notion of race along with the notion of class, there you will, or at least it yielded different kinds of results in ways that the workers at Moncure, at the plywood factory, were acutely aware that the holders of private equity at Atlas Holdings were white, based in Greenwich, Connecticut, and determined to grind them into the ground. And they felt that this was driven not only by class, but profoundly by race, and that these private equity holders were determined to turn them out. And they often referred to slavery. They referred to the legacy of racism in the South, of course, also in the North, right? I mean, it's not just the South, it's the private equity holders in North, Connecticut too. I mean, everybody's involved here. So the way in which they reflected on race and class was distinctive in Moncure, as opposed to only in Bethlehem. I'm profoundly glad that I started in Moncure Plywood in North Carolina, and appreciative of the colleague who encouraged me also to look at the traditional white evangelicals, which, as it goes in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, was a worthy thing to do, I feel. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. I'm glad that you mentioned social class there too, because I think that's the other really interesting contribution of the book. Scholars who are interested in religion in the contemporary U.S., especially scholars who are studying evangelicals at present, rarely pay much attention to social class. And as Ken mentioned, there's, of course, an unspoken assumption that if you're talking about evangelicals, you're talking about white evangelicals, and so it's important to show that that's more complicated. But also, it's more complicated in terms of class, and I think your book sort of shows that in terms of the way that when we talk about class, when we experience class, we don't often, we don't do it as a sociologist, right? So we don't have that vocabulary, and we don't necessarily think of it in those terms. So, but we experience class as manifested by social arrangements and by power, right? So when people are at work, and they feel like they have no control at work, then they're experiencing their class location as it gets manifest in various sort of everyday ways. So I wanted to ask you if you could summarize, for people who are interested in studying contemporary religion, how do they need to understand the contribution of social class to contemporary religion?
Right. That, we are all classed individuals. Whether we identify as working class or whether we identify as middle class or upper class. Sometimes we think about class in terms of income stratification. I tend to think of it, and following my colleagues at the Working Class Studies Association, think about it in terms of power. Power on the job, power at work, or the lack of power at work. And that's going to profoundly affect your feelings and your thoughts and your consciousness about really everything, including religion, and how you also conceptualize what your religion is telling you about what you should and shouldn't be doing at the workplace. And I find that to be very, very fascinating, because I grew up evangelical, and my father in my family, we were working class. And thinking about that as a young person in New Hampshire, it's like, well, what better source to draw upon than my family, which is working class, my family, which is evangelical, and my father, who thought, as an evangelical, that work is cursed because of human sin. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, he really believed that, literally, as a good evangelical, and I did too, as a younger person. And so, my father saw work as cursed in the factory. Yes, of course. So, and his religious consciousness about the fate of humanity was very much reflected in his experience in the factory. And so during lunch, he would go out to the truck, the van that we had, the white Ford van, and pray during lunch. He didn't belong to a union, like my Moncure colleagues there, who would pray and be on the picket line. I don't know if I've answered, but that...
Yeah. That leads me to my next question, as it turns out. So, when we think about social class, we want to do it in a way that's not mechanical and just sort of thinks of it as a variable, in a model, but that it's an aspect of people's lived experience, right? And so even when people don't describe their experience in class terms, we can, as scholars, we can understand that it's influencing the way that people live, and that it's not, that religion isn't somehow exempted from the way that class structures, contemporary society, including contemporary American society. And that leads me to another key idea in the book. And again, I think if you're interested in studying religion, the academic study of religion, you'll find this really interesting, because we have a tendency, especially with evangelicals, but I think with religious experience more broadly, to think of it in terms of belief. That if you're religious, you must believe something. And so evangelicals will often talk, and Ken mentioned, some of the key religious beliefs that scholars use to identify people as evangelicals, right? Are you born again? Do you believe in biblical inerrancy? But Ken points out in the book that people experience religion not just in terms of what they believe, but also in how they act, right? It's a force that shapes their decision-making at work, their decision-making within their family, and so forth. And so there's a tension that comes out throughout the book about evangelicals typically adhere to a tenet that we have to respect worldly authority because God has ordained all authority. And so there's an emphasis in evangelical culture on obedience, right? That's a sign of a good moral standing in one's salvation and so forth. And that being rebellious is a sign of the opposite of those things, right? And so, but in a context where you're experiencing stresses that come from the way that your work is structured that feel to you unfair, that you want to say, well, that, there's and there are other tenets that evangelicals accept that suggest that employers have a responsibility too, that it's not all just one way. But there's that tension because that aspect of the culture and the value of obedience is so profound, but then they find ways to express their religion in terms of what they, not only what they believe, but what they feel and how they act, that find ways to express their Christian identity at work that isn't simply reducible to obedience. And so I wonder, that's a really long-winded question, so maybe I should just restate it. Like, if you could, again, sort of summarize how it is that the people that you interviewed grappled with an understanding that in some sense they had to obey managers at work, but also that they had to stand up for themselves and not be treated as a fool, right? Because that was also a part of evangelical culture.
Yes. So you may have heard of the hymn, trust and obey, for there is no other way, than to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. So I grew up with that hymn. And, and this was borne out in many ways in the conversations I had with the evangelicals in both Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and Moncure, North Carolina. How did these workers grapple with the tension of obedience as taught by the book of Romans, obeying worldly authorities, and at the same time realizing that worldly authorities, that is their bosses, were asking them to do, to overwork, to not go to church because you need to be at work on Sunday. They were acutely aware that they were in a bind. What are they going to do? And so through, being with them and asking them questions, I came to learn that for them, the union was an authority as well. Looking at my union colleagues, that the union contract is an authority as well, and that you need to be attentive to that authority. The question is, how do you then obey competing or contradictory authorities? And that's where things get interesting and difficult and challenging. And you had hinted at it. I remember one worker, I believe I used her name, Sandra. I believe I disguised her name, we'll put it that way. So for the record, any lineup of Sandra spoken and Sandra in this book are not the same person. So she said to me that, and she appealed to notions of dignity. This is the secretary of Local 369 in Moncure, North Carolina, a plywood worker. She appealed to notions of dignity and fairness and not being made a fool of. That God created us in His image, to use their language now. I'm repeating what I heard. God created us in His image, and we do not, God didn't make us to be fools. That's not what God intended. We have dignity as workers, and we have to be mindful of that as well. And so there was somewhat of an appeal not only to the notion of how to manage competing authorities, but sort of like a meta-ethic, an ethic that sort of stands over the injunction to obey authority, and that's to think about questions about dignity. And who, in whose image are we made? And we're not to be made fools of. We won't do that. And so much so that these evangelical workers at Moncure Plywood did go on strike. And when they went on strike, because Atlas Holdings was prepared to just do them in and get rid of their union, they went on strike. And that was a very clear line in the sand that we now are identifying fully with our union. We walked off the job, and we are going to picket in front of Moncure Plywood, which they did for 9 months. And they would have prayer meetings and sing-alongs, very religious, very evangelical on the picket line. So for them, faithful obedience, was walking out of the job, going on strike, and experiencing God on the picket line. And that experience with them was, it was life-changing. It was life-changing. To follow up with the earliest conversations with my father about, what he was trying to do, going back to your point about, my father didn't talk about ownership of the means of production. He wasn't reading his Karl Marx, but he was reading his Bible, during lunch, on a 15-minute break in an 8-hour workday. At least we had an 8-hour workday. So he thought about work, in religious terms. And so following up on that, that's what led me to Moncure Plywood and to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is all to say that when you're doing your own research, it's, I think, allow me to say, it's legitimate to think about your own life experience, and to think about your friends, to think about your families, to think about your communities, and to look for ways to be accountable to them.
Good. Yeah, so I have just one more question, and I hope you'll think about things to ask Professor Estey, and that maybe you're thinking of that related to what we've been talking about, even if they're not strictly questions about the book. So I love the way that you described the evangelicals on strike and the picket line, and the way in which that became an opportunity for them to practice their faith, because it's so contrary to what we think of. We don't think of the picket line as a religious context, right? But it was for these folks. And so it suggests there's a kind of really amazing creativity that people bring, that all of us bring to our lives, in terms of the way that we make manifest in our lives the things that are important to us. And so for members of this union who were forced by the circumstances to make a decision about withholding their labor, they were thinking about that as full persons, and so their faith informed the way that they enacted that choice, and then they made, that's not a conventional picket line tactic, right, to have Bible readings and prayers and song and so forth, but it is a really creative solution to that problem for the community. And so I wonder if you can think about the contrast then with the white evangelicals in Pennsylvania who were in the same congregation, remember, but working in different places. And so their work circumstances and economic circumstances are all a little bit different, but especially for the school teachers, right, in Pennsylvania, the challenges of that profession, can you imagine, well, maybe, look, I'll put it this way, so kind of hypothetical. If you could bring some of those teachers from Pennsylvania to the plywood factory and have on the picket line there and have them talk with their fellow evangelicals, would there be, do you think there would be an understanding of the way in which the picket line itself became a site of religious expression?
Oh yeah, for sure, because the evangelicals in Bethlehem, also had and this is one aspect of evangelicalism is a deep appreciation for the power and movement of the Holy Spirit, and so holding fast to the third person of the Trinity, that the workers in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania would definitely see themselves, in the religious expression of the plywood factory workers in Moncure. I think they would see that. But the one experience I had with with Diane in New Covenant Christian Community Church, evangelical and also a union leader. And she was called, Diane, she felt, to be fierce as a union activist. And at the same time was having difficulty, and I'm not sure where she ended up on this, but she was having a lot of difficulty with being a fierce union activist, and also what she felt her church was also telling her about what it means to be a good Christian as well. And she wasn't sure whether she could be a fierce advocate and, by any means necessary, get the job done as a union activist and still be the kind of Christian that she felt she should be as a born-again Christian. That's a story that I would love to follow up on and see where she ended up. But she felt the tension fairly acutely. I think what happened in Moncure is because they went on strike, they had to, which side are you on? And the side that they were on was on the other side of the street, out there picketing. So it was clear for them. But the workers I interviewed in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, never went on strike. But they did have, they did feel a considerable amount of tension in the various workplaces that they engaged in.
Good. Okay, well, we've talked for a bit. I hope that that's generated some interest, but I want to make sure that we have ample time also to engage with you. I mean, you should mainly direct your questions to Ken. I'm happy to contribute however I can as well. But
and if I can just jump in, we still got plenty of pizza. We still got plenty of drinks. So please, as we're going to the question and answer, feel free. But we have some questions, and we have a tradition at the Wolf Institute. The students go first, and Bobby tends to go first. So let's go 1, 2, 3.
All right. I know about, given the fact what's going on with Trump and his attempts to suppress labor unions, with all the union busting around like Amazon and other stuff, what do you think this book could help influence the unions, given the fact what's going on in America right now?
Yes.
excellent question.
Yeah. No, that's exactly what I was trying to do. In other words, to ask the question, what if we thought about labor as including evangelicals? And what if we thought of evangelicals, in part including labor unions? In other words, labor evangelicals. That is to say, to go off the beaten track of assuming that all white evangelicals or all evangelicals support, whether it's the Republican Party or support capitalism or support, now in this context, Trump. What if there were different kinds of evangelicals who had a different sort of orientation that could actually appeal to their own best historical tradition? That we don't think of evangelicals as necessarily independent. We think of them as solely bound up with the Republican Party. But what if there are evangelicals who eschew both the Republican and the Democratic Party and adhere to their theological notions of, say, fairness, justice, and dignity? Now the evangelicals going to their best traditions, avoiding any kind of alignment and holding everything in judgment. I think that's a question to at least ponder.
I actually have 2 questions, but they're both very different. My first one is with evangelicalism being a more modern subculture of Christianity compared to Catholicism or Protestantism, and how it seems, or just from what you're speaking of, to be dependent on capitalism, can there be a form of evangelicalism that isn't dependent on capitalism, or a form that maybe reforms the religion as a whole to make it less interdependent with capitalism and our capitalist society today?
Right. So, exactly. So the situation is that we think about Christianity in terms of, we think about Protestantism, Catholicism, or Orthodoxy, the 3 major, say, branches. So evangelicalism falling within the realm or the branch of Protestantism. And then, depending on which evangelical you talk to, you could say, oh, well, evangelicalism actually is rooted in the very Lutheranism, and the break-off branches from Lutheranism, Anabaptists, or, and so on and so forth. So you go all the way back to the Reformation by some evangelical standards or by some historians. And then others would say, well, let's think about evangelicalism as a more contemporary manifestation of a breakaway Protestant groups after World War II. So you have that version of evangelicalism, which is really very recent, in the last 80 years. And for those historians of evangelicalism who look at it in the last 80 years, many of those historians are saying, don't forget the left evangelicals, don't forget the centrist evangelicals. You know, there's a whole world out there that were questioning all sorts of things. Or other historians are saying, well, if we think of evangelicalism as going back into the 19th century, you know, anti-slavery evangelicals, plenty of pro-slavery evangelicals, but also anti-slavery evangelicals, and so on. So it depends on the historian, and it depends on the brand of it depends on the how you begin to categorize evangelicalism. And if you can begin to think about evangelicalism as not only aligned with, say, Trump, but also a whole tradition of social justice evangelicals who and sometimes even identify with the Democratic Party. So this raises all sorts of questions, and the inquiry goes on and on and on, and deeply fascinating for historians of Christianity in the United States. Did you have a question?
Yeah. And also,
sorry, yeah.
how do you view like televangelism in connection to like the Labor Evangelicals and how like they are connecting like the promotion of evangelicalism to their like godliness and creating this like whole persona around it?
Yeah, well, you know, one of the churches, and I wish I could have talked more about the pastors, but one of the churches that from which some of the workers came in Moncure, that the pastor, from what I could tell, she was speaking from a perspective of a prosperity gospel. That was, you know, that seems to be characteristic of some tele-evangelical, you know, preachers. But the workers, you know, in her church were union members trying to figure out what was going on down to the plywood factory. And so that was an interesting tension that I didn't get to explore as much as I would like to have.
Mr. Johnson?
I'm just humbled by these questions you guys are asking. My question is about gender, right? So the three examples you've just given us of Caroline, Sandra, and this pastor are all women.
Yes.
And then you were, Tim, were asking questions about obey. There's so much around obeying male authority. I wondered what you learned about gender and thinking about these questions, and how these evangelicals think about gender.
Well, certainly the sense of evangelical teaching is either a subordinationist orientation where male leadership is held out as biblical and therefore ideal. There's also a complementary understanding like, well, you know, both the man and the woman, the husband and the wife work together, but the male still, the father, the husband still has primacy, even if there's a complementarity, you know. But in the union context, especially in Moncure, the women were fierce in their leadership and in their advocacy. And while the leadership of the union was certainly male-dominated all the way through, women in the union were very fierce, very organized, and very vocal in ways that we might not expect, because let the men speak. But the women were speaking, and they were speaking loudly, and they were leading out in front and from, and yeah, they were out front. Yeah, they really were. And they were an inspiring group. In Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, I wasn't able to, but that would be another, I'll leave it at Moncure anyway, yeah.
Another question.
I have a question about SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and Martin Luther King and his fellow pastors wrestling
Yes.
to, as part of the civil rights movement, to overturn this submissiveness within the black church as part of that was part of their movement. They had a religious movement and a movement in front of Woolworths picketing or whatever.
Yes.
And so when you're contrasting the white church in Bethlehem and the black church in North Carolina, I understand this is, if it's a prosperity gospel church, that is very far from Martin Luther King anyway, right? But I wondered if you thought there was any kind of residue of that struggle that you saw.
Yeah, I know. It's a great question, and I remember talking with Jean Deal Harris about this as well. And she said, well, talk to the pastors, and I did talk to the pastors, and I was looking, sort of seeing like, well, what of that historical legacy? And I have to say that, this was, 4 or 5 churches, and I was not picking that up personally, and with the interviews with the workers. It didn't seem, yes, the churches were supportive individually. They were supporting individuals that went to their church. And maybe there was some money that went, as part of a relief fund. But outside of the pastors who were also union members and on the picket line, outside of William Harrington and Alan Moore, outside of those two, who were plywood workers, ministers, and on the picket line, for the pastors of the churches where other workers were coming from, no, I did not pick that up. And the workers themselves were feeling a little bit, generally speaking, I think they felt a little bit let down. Even as a church may offer part of their space for union meetings and such, it just didn't seem to be a kind of constant or line of continuity from those churches to the workers themselves, and some sort of greater solidarity. I didn't pick that up.
But they weren't preaching for them to submit to their bosses either.
That I didn't pick up either.
Yeah.
So they were generally sympathetic, but yeah, but they weren't overtly organizing in support either.
I'm fascinated by this idea of the authority of the union. I just wanted to invite you to flesh that out a little bit more, like how that was. I don't know very much about the context, but like on what basis? Because I'm also imagining ideas of like union as horizontal organizing and solidarity. So like how is that? How is this like?
Sure.
Up down, like side, like how does that? Yeah, I'm just curious.
Sure. So the authority of the union, that construction was in relationship to the authorities at the workplace. So it was less a comment about the structure of the union local itself, and more a framing in relationship to the authorities or the would-be authorities in the workplace. So that's how I picked up what they meant by the authority. And the interesting, I interviewed a glass worker, that is to say someone who puts up glass in storefronts and such, and this particular person at Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, who also led the choir and the music at New Covenant Christian Community Church, really centered in on the authority of the contract, in relationship to what he was being asked to do at his workplace. And he said, well, isn't the union contract an authority too? And I'm like, yeah, it is. yes, thank you, I like that. But as far as like union democracy, and the sort of the democratic practices within the union, no, we didn't. I didn't really get into that discussion, or we didn't really talk about that. But it's an excellent discussion to have, because it could well be the case, looking back, that had there been a more robust democracy within Local 369, maybe the other half that stayed in the plant might have come out. And so, not to, to offer some possible critique of Local 369, that maybe they themselves had failed their own union over time. And that was also a product, too, of the fact that they had uncontroversial contract renewals for decades until they were challenged. And that's when they really needed their own democracy. And maybe, in fact, they didn't have it.
You know, and on top of that, the local belonged to a union
Yes.
that was
Yes.
pretty
Yes.
unresponsive to that.
Absolutely.
And so more union democracy in
Yes.
the international would have maybe evoked a different response as well.
Because there were a woodworkers union inside a machinist international that pretty much sold them down the proverbial river. So yeah, thank you for reminding me. Yes, they were inside an international that didn't care. They didn't care about these people in North Carolina. They didn't want to rock the boat, and they just didn't care. They were forced at the end to do something, but it was nowhere near enough. They were effectively finished as a union.
A couple more questions. Let's go 1, 2, and 3. Why don't we go through the 3 questions, and then you have a chance to respond to them in groups. Just for time's sake.
Sure.
As Trump has risen to power, have you noticed a shift in how these communities view politics and how involved they are?
Okay. Let's go. Your question.
Mine's actually pretty related to that as well. But kind of, you mentioned that you've been interviewing these people over the course of, past 10, 20 years. How would you say that the shift from the working class movements away from the Democratic Party has been primarily religiously motivated, or is that more political, unionized decisions? And what would you say is the rationale behind that shift?
A shift from the Democratic?
Yeah, or like away towards the Republican white Christian nationalist movement that we see today in politics.
Right.
Until we come back for the last question.
And I know that you said that you've been doing this for like 3 years at this point, like doing the interviews and research. How's like you doing this influenced your political, the way that you see politics and the way that you see politics and the way that you kind of critique or scrutinize political rebellion or in the case of the union, political complacency or compliance.
Okay. The way I see politics, the Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, New Covenant Community Christian Church was having some pretty heated disputes about, should we support Mitt Romney or should we support, Obama, early on. And they were issuing guidelines amongst themselves about how to have civil discourse inside their church. And this is an evangelical church, and they're having debates, political debates. And so the way I see politics, at least, is that just don't make assumptions about people. You think, oh, they're evangelical, therefore they. It's like, no, you just don't know until you start asking. And I think that's so profoundly exciting. Is that the task of the researcher, or the task of all of us as human beings, is to listen to each other, at least first. Try to do that first before you say anything. Just try. And so it made far more complex my view of politics and the relationship between politics and religion, which is why I love to teach the course Religion and Politics, or Politics and Religion, depending on how we list it in the catalog, just to explore these types of questions. And as far as the story is that the research was conducted before. Trying to think. The book was published after, the Trump years, but the majority of the research. My last interview was in 2017, so the research was happening before Trump was fully, sort of fully in our consciousness. And you work with that as you will, And so, so the issue was really about. Managing, the sort of the Romney Republicans and the Obama Democrats and such. Lewis Cameron, the head of the union, was an Obama supporter. And the pastor of New Covenant Christian Community Church was saying, well, I think we're pretty much 55% Republican, 45% Democrat, Democratic Party. This is in Pennsylvania, a swing state. Now, just sort of answering somewhat impressionistically, but working with the three questions, the shift from the Democratic Party toward white Christian nationalism, you know, taking the lead on that white Christian nationalism question, you know, and the story is that, I guess, to maybe just go right into one aspect of the question, it would not behoove us to line up, not that you're doing it, but I'm just saying it generally, it would not behoove us to line up evangelicalism and white Christian nationalism. Because there are plenty of evangelicals out there, white and African American and Asian American and Latino, Latinx evangelicals of all sorts who are profoundly asking profound questions, deeply opposed, that white Christian nationalism is heresy, it's ungodly, and has to be stopped. There are evangelicals of all sorts who are asking the right questions about white Christian nationalism, and all the power to them. All the power to them. You may say, well, I'm not, you know, one may say, I'm not evangelical, but are alliances possible? Political alliances possible with those kinds of evangelicals? Maybe. That's a question to ponder. When we're doing a new kind of politics that's going to be outside of just the realm of sort of a secular understanding of the Democratic Party and what they've done in the past or what they could do in the future.
Fantastic. I want to thank you both for bringing us together, building together.